These evenings that happen every other month and will happen again in November as a bi-monthly, every other month event are brought to you by three organizations. I just want to make sure you all know and appreciate them. The first organization is the Judson Memorial Church, in which you are currently seated, which has been sponsoring this activity. In the words of the minister here, Donna Scapper, she feels that this kind of an evening and this kind of a presentation is, to quote her, part of the mission of this church, which is something I think you'll think about already now and after the evening's over, maybe even more. That's a remarkable commitment on the part of a religious cleric, and she's been a wonderful host to these events, and we are very appreciative that she makes the church available for them. The second organization is the Left Forum. I think many of you know about it. Every spring it has a huge conference. This year it was at the end of June at Long Island University over in Brooklyn. And it is already engaged in planning Left Forum 2020, and you will be hearing about that in the months ahead. And the third organization that actually puts all of this together is Democracy at Work, which is the organization I work most closely with to produce these events. And we also produce a number of other events, and I want very, very briefly, I promise, to mention a few of them to you now. One of the things we have begun to do, we have produced our first book, and the book, this is it, is called Understanding Marxism. And the book was written because of the number of inquiries coming into us by email, through Facebook, Twitter, you name it, people asking, and I mean this quite sincerely, what is it? That is, what is Marxism? Where does it come from? What's it about? Is it as evil as my mother told me it was? And so forth. Ever since we started becoming as big a public operation as we now are, with our radio show and TV show and all the rest that we do, all of which you can find out about by going to the website democracyatwork.info, which is where you can get all the information you can possibly want, and actually more than that. Ever since we started doing that, people are asking us questions, and it's literally overwhelming. We can't handle the number of emails. I mean, it's a good problem to have, given our politics, that America is as open to this. And by the way, we are all over the world, so we get them from literally every country. So this is a book that was designed to give an introductory overview, both of what Marxism is and how it has changed, particularly in the last 40 or 50 years. If you live in the United States, these changes are mostly, unless you're a very unusual person, unknown to you because they get exactly no coverage. Neither in the press nor in academic circles, I know, because those are the circles I travel in. If you are interested in this book, either as someone watching this program through the internet or someone here in the live audience tonight, if you're in the live audience, the books will be for sale. They're inexpensive. It's not a big fat book. You can get it on your way out. If you're watching, very simple. You go to lulu.com, Lulu.com, put in my name, Richard Wolff, and you can order the book there. It's available both in this hardcover and for a good bit less money. This, I think, runs $20 or $25. It's not expensive, but you can also get an ebook, which is even cheaper, I think $9 or something like that. So you can get it in whatever way you want. Second, this series, Global Capitalism Live Economic Update, GCLEU, has its own Patreon page. If you know what Patreon is, it's a fundraising website. If you're interested in supporting us, which we certainly would welcome, you go to patreon.com, GCLEU, and you can do that, and we would, of course, be grateful. The same is true for our YouTube channel. If you know how these things work, you can sign up to be a subscriber of the YouTube channel. Hit that little bell button, and you can be informed every time we put something new up on the YouTube channels that we maintain, which is several times a day. So there's lots of material there. We also encourage people who might want to sponsor one of these evenings. It's very simple. If you want to do that, go to democracyatwork.info/sponsor, and it'll explain to you how to do that. In addition to our weekly radio and television program called Economic Update, which is available, I want to tell you all, it's broadcast as a radio program on just under 100 stations, radio stations across the United States. It is also produced simultaneously as a television program. It goes out through the Free Speech TV network and a couple of other networks and goes into roughly 55 million American homes. Given what you're about to hear, if you haven't been at one of these before, you will recognize that there's even a historic significance to this sort of thing being available to the American people on a scale that has not been the case before. We're also expanding. We produce podcasts. That is, we produce whole series of presentations by people who do one every couple of weeks, and we, at our websites and so forth, you can go and you can also listen to them on iTunes and Google Play and all the platforms where we have people that have something to contribute to the kind of movement we hope to be part of and building. And you can also find out about those. One of them is called Anti-Capitalist Chronicles. That is done by David Harvey. Some of you know him. He's a professor at the City University of New York. He does a regular one. A lawyer who's close to us in Puerto Rico has a running commentary on events in Puerto Rico having to do with both the problems and the struggles that are going on there. Capitalism Hits Home, Dr. Harriet Fraud, some of you know because she works with me on the radio and TV programs, talking about how capitalism shapes personal life, home life, intimate relationships, all of that. And we're about to launch a new one called All Things Co-op, a kind of an ongoing update about all kinds of efforts to build cooperative workplaces as alternatives to capitalist hierarchical workplaces around the country. So if any of those are interesting to you, go to the website. You can find out everything there. I've been asked to let you all know that there is a major climate change demonstration, if I understand correctly, on the 20th of this month, a week from this Friday. Does anyone here have the specifics of time and place? That's why, because I don't have them and I'd love to let everybody know. Yes? Foley Square at noon. Okay, so. Okay, so 12 to 5, meeting at 12 o'clock, Foley Square, Friday, September 20. And Greta Thunberg will be there, as I am told. So she will be the kind of leader which, given her role over the last few months, she clearly deserves.
I heard it this morning. It was great.
Yes, yes. I do not think that Donald Trump will be there. But where is Foley Square? Does someone give me some help here?
It's down by the courts.
It's the Brooklyn Bridge stop, I think, on the number 6 train. 4, 5, and 6. Okay. Close to City Hall. All right. Last time we were here was a couple of months ago. Since this is an attempt to update you on things that have been happening in the world economy, are there empty seats around? Because I think we're beginning to run out. Anyone have an empty seat? Wave your hand so that folks coming in can. There are some seats up here. There are 2 of them, I think, here, 3. So if you want seats up front, you don't have to sit on the floor or stand. Unless you'd like to. That's, of course, fine. Okay. So let's jump in, make use of our time. An enormous, and you know, I do this for a living, this watching the economy and explaining and trying to interpret it. But I can't remember a month or 2-month period as chock full of explosive transformations in the world economy on a scale of the last 2 months. So it was difficult for me to focus in on what to stress with you tonight, because there really is so much. Let me give you an overview of what I mean by so much. One of the great empires of the world, the British Empire, is in the final months of disintegration. In the last 2 days, the Supreme Court of Scotland explained to the Prime Minister of Great Britain that he was in violation of the law and could not end the meetings of Parliament. I mean, what I just said is staggering. On some levels, the British invented the modern Parliament. And to have reached the point where the only way forward that they can possibly think of is to shut down the elected. Imagine if, well, that isn't so hard, is it? Imagine if Mr. Trump were to tell the senators and the representatives to go home, which is what they're trying to do in England, basically go home for the period roughly mid-September to mid-October.
He can legally do that.
Yes, well, that's the question. The Supreme Court of Scotland just decided he cannot.
No, Trump can do that.
Yeah, Trump can do it, right? But it's an open question. Mr. Trump clearly has the Supreme Court on his side. For those of you who did not notice, the Supreme Court gave him today, this afternoon, the right basically to deny asylum to refugees, to force them to ask for asylum before they get to the United States, and to arrange to have it denied in Mexico or wherever they might be coming. That was a tough case. They were supposed to not have that go through while it's being appealed. The Supreme Court said the law can apply while it's being appealed, which will deny entry to refugees in a way that really is a major break from much of America, not all of American history, but much of American history in terms of its opening. But let's go back to England. That was once the great empire. The sun never sets on the British Empire. Britannia rules the waves. Or, as the critic said, Britannia waves the rules, or whichever way you like. They waved the rules in order to be able to rule the waves. They're done. They are finished. They are probably finished no matter what happens now. And that is a major end of what was an empire of several centuries in building itself up and ruling. That is a major change. Here's another one. In many countries of Europe right now, the central banks, and we're talking Germany and other major countries, are so desperate about the recession hitting Europe now. That's a Europe that isn't out of the last capitalist crash of 2008 yet, is now about to be hit by another, that they have taken an extraordinary step of reducing interest rates, hoping that people will borrow cheap money and so buy things or invest in their companies. When that didn't work, they took the next logical step. They now have, for trillions of dollars, negative interest rates. Here's how that works. You take $100 and you give it to the bank. And at the end of the year, they give you back 97. Do you understand? You don't get interest, you pay interest for them to hold your money. Now imagine if you are, with this serious, imagine if you are an older person. Luckily, nobody in this room is an older person. But if you were an older person and you were relying on what you thought were secure savings paying you an interest, you will now face a situation where in your declining years, whatever money you're putting away will shrink every year. So you'll have the lovely experience. The prices will go up and your savings will go down. This is called not good. Or rather, not good for you. It has extraordinary consequences. And yesterday, Mr. Trump, the President of the United States, referring to the Federal Reserve, the most important monetary authority in the United States and in many ways in the world, not only called them, I quote, boneheads. Interesting. He named Mr. Powell the head of the Federal Reserve. The whole collection of them are boneheads. Why? Because they haven't lowered interest rates, including negative interest rates. In Europe, the move to negative interest rates has not overcome or stopped the impending recession. Mr. Trump, choosing carefully what facts he admits into his brain and not, and the people around him likewise, seems not to get that, so he wants to do that here. We'll come back to why he's so desperate about the recession hitting here, which he is. Every time you hear President Trump talk about how great the economy is, please understand, he keeps saying that because it isn't. And that's going to be how you will, I'll go through with you why that shapes what he does. But these are extraordinary steps. Negative interest rates for trillions of dollars, collapse of the British Empire. Couple of others. The United States has been at war in Afghanistan for a long time. Little details for you to think about. The Taliban, the ostensible enemy of the United States, against which the invasion was launched, are now controlling a significantly larger part of Afghanistan than when the United States invaded. Or to say the same thing in plain English, the United States has been defeated in Afghanistan, which every major newspaper in Europe has as a headline, and has already for months. Here in the United States, where you live in a media bubble, this is not made a big thing of. By the way, not just by conservatives and Republicans, but by the good old New York Times as well. But it is a reality. So glaring is that reality that it is dangerous for Mr. Trump's reelection. He may be attacked by the Democrats, particularly if Warren or Sanders are major players, for what? For being the leader at a time of losing a war, not good for election purposes, which is why he came this close to meeting with the Taliban at Camp David 4 or 5 days ago. Mr. Trump's enemies, who don't want that, leaked that information. It got out, and Mr. Trump had to run in the other direction as fast as possible. But not just run in the other direction. Get that off the headlines. Stop letting people come to terms with this un-American fact that we just fought one of the longest, one of the most costly wars in our history, and we were soundly defeated by people much smaller, much less well-armed, and much poorer than we were or are. Not good to run on. And so you had to get the pressure off, and you had to get the headlines off. And how did you do that? 2 things. You told a story, an old story, about some very wonderful made-for-TV dramatic event in which a spy, that's always exciting, in Russia, even more exciting, was miraculously extracted by our noble CIA. I mean, comic books can't do it this way. And it's exciting, and it gets the disaster of that war off the headline. And the second thing that was done, and I don't want anyone here to cry, was to fire Mr. Bolton, because that got him a lot of attention too, and you could have big discussion. Was he fired? Did he resign? Who cares? Even Mrs. Bolton doesn't care. Right? But these are very good because it gets that Taliban disaster off. Folks, these are signs not only of the chaos, but these are signs of the system can't function. It can't function. All right, let's turn then to a few introductory things. That was just to get you kind of in the mood. Big things are happening, somewhat scary, but also the level of change in our society is accelerating. You know, a great political strategist who was asked by his followers many years ago, "Why is everything going so slow?" gave him this answer: For decades, he said, nothing happens. And then in a few weeks, decades happen. You're beginning to move from the first to the second. Things are speeding up, and it's a little hard to keep up with it. All right, so let's begin. First, an item not connected to China, which is our major focus and these big questions, but something that is so powerful, a window into this United States at this point that I wanted to talk about it. We are in the state of New York, and the state of New York has a governor named Cuomo. And in order to get popular participation in the government, something he spends most of his life trying to avoid, he asked citizens to comment on the design of license plates. Some of you may have noticed this. So if you would like a different color or a different graphic, or I don't know, maybe you'd like a flower on it, or a real flower pressed into it, whatever, or a picture of your grandmother, whatever you might want, he was interested in doing that. So I want to stress to you, here's what he did not ask you to comment on, namely, how are license plates produced? Where? And by whom? In case the American public, or at least the New York State public, would have a thought about that, wanting to have some input about something that we're hanging on the back of our cars, if we have one, or there's one on the back of a cab if you use that, or the bus if you ride that, etc. So for those of you who don't know, a little bit of background. License plates are made by prisoners in prisons. Right? So the people who are sent to jail to punish them for whatever crimes they are convicted of are subjected to pressures, I'm trying to be polite here, to work. The going rate in New York's prisons for working and making license plates is 65 cents per hour. I need a moment of silence so that it can sink in. 65 cents an hour. Why is that possible? Since, of course, it violates the law about what minimum wages are, both the federal law, which says the minimum wage you can pay a person is $7.25 an hour, and the state of New York, which has a separate minimum wage, which is a good bit higher than that. But not in jail. There you can pay people 65 cents an hour. Why is that? Because people in jail do not have civil rights in the United States. Why not? Well, they don't even have the right to dispose of their own bodies. Or another way of saying it is, they are slaves. They have masters who can control them, bodily and mind. Why is that possible? Again, for those of you not familiar, the 13th Amendment of the United States Constitution, a product of the Civil War that was supposed to have freed the slaves, right, with the Emancipation Proclamation, the 13th Amendment did outlaw slavery, but it included, go read it, it's only 2 sentences long, won't take long, the 13th Amendment. It made one exception to the abolition of slavery. Prisoners, inmates in prison were not subject to the prohibition on slavery. It was not outlawed. For those of you who don't know, the United States has the highest percentage of its population in prison of any country on this planet, and the overwhelming majority of them are not white. In other words, slavery wasn't abolished, it was moved. And the same people, or at least many of the same people who once were slaves, have their descendants now still slaves to the extent that they are in prison making license plates. Mr. Cuomo did not ask for any comment whatsoever on any of this. He would like your input on decorating the plates, but not on what, of course, matters more. Last point. I don't think you can find, even in this country's conservative population, an article or a book that would make the argument that the rehabilitation or even the punishment of a quote-unquote criminal should include not only being taken out of his or her home, family, community, not being incarcerated in a place where you can't go anywhere unless you have permission, not subject to the pressures, rules, assaults that we all know are part of prison. That's not enough. You have to be made to work for 65 cents an hour and to be treated like a slave. What kind of rehabilitation would you imagine that accomplishes in a person to have their freedom taken away and to be required to live for years as a slave? If you want to know why we have a high rate of recidivism in this country, recidivism is the formal word for people who go finish their sentence, go out into the world, and come back into jail because they run afoul of the law again. Returners. We have a very high rate of recidivism. It might have something to do with treating people as slaves for a long period of time, given what we went through in this country to abolish slavery. It's an extraordinary reality. It is not unique to New York State. There are states that have a worse set of conditions than we do, but we're right up there. So if you thought you lived in a liberal state, not so much. Not so much. Okay. Next. I'm going to stay with the announced agenda because it'll be so hard to go through these topics. I can't do the normal opening where I give you a half a dozen of these short ones. We don't have the time. We have had some, and we're going to have some more, big, nasty hurricanes. You all saw in the recent days what happened to the Bahamas when Dorian went through there. And you're watching our lovely president make sure nobody from the Bahamas comes here. We're helping them there, so they shouldn't come here. That has something maybe to do with the color of the people in Bahama, but we won't go there. We'll leave that alone. We'll pretend we don't notice that. That's not what I want to talk to you about. I want to talk to you about hurricanes and the extraordinary lack of preparation for hurricanes. Every time, by the way, hurricanes, just for those of you that are not into meteorology, hurricanes are not, ready, new. They have been happening for centuries. And it's very convenient. They happen pretty much in the same place. I mean, some variation, but we kind of know where they form, how they blow, and a few miles this way, a few miles that way, sure. And for the people in that path, that's of course very important, but we kind of generally know. Okay? Minnesota doesn't have a lot of them. Florida has a hell of a lot of them, et cetera, et cetera. So we know what they can do, we know how strong they are, we've been through them, we have 8 million documents, films. Why in the world are why are we again suffering houses being destroyed, roads being what? What's going on here? Now the answer is, and it's really important, capitalism's incentive system. And I want to hammer at that because a number of you get told as you go through school, and on behalf of the school I want to apologize, you're told that one of the great virtues of capitalism is that it provides incentives. This is a very deep idea which says if you give someone a reward for doing something, they're more likely to do it. What this has to do with capitalism has always been a mystery to me, but it is used by people because they want to say, for which there's little evidence, that capitalism gives you more of an incentive than every other system gave its people incentives. For those of you who don't know, mathematics was invented long before there was capitalism, and lots of other delicious things that we rely on were invented without capitalism. So Why capitalism should get the prize for an incentive, I don't know, but that's not my point, even though I would enjoy spending time on it with you, as you can tell. Here's the problem with incentives. They cut lots of different ways. I'm going to give you a couple of examples having to do with hurricanes. We know perfectly well how to prepare a house, an individual home, an apartment house, anything else, to withstand hurricanes. We know how to do that. We've known how to do that for decades. Here's the problem. The home builder, who knows exactly how to do it, could do it for the houses he or she builds in the path of a hurricane. But here's the problem, you see. It's harder to sell the house to Americans who don't have enough money to buy a house if you equip it with what it needs to have to withstand a hurricane. So the builder, whose job it is not to prepare for hurricanes, but to sell the damn house, preferably at a profit, has no, ready, incentive to jack up the price of that house by doing what would be necessary. And he hopes like hell that the working class family, desperate to have a home of their own, barely able to afford the mortgage for this one, can be convinced into buying that house without looking real closely whether it is protected. You see, capitalism is based on profit, and the profit incentive produces crappy houses not prepared for hurricanes over and over again. So when someone tells you next time about capitalism incentive system, please remember this. Yeah, it has lots of incentives. And for every one that has a nice outcome, I will provide you with one with a hair-raising outcome, such as hurricanes. And the reason I stress this is because, having watched very closely the news reporting in this country about hurricanes, I have never heard any commentator ever make this argument on any radio or television program, which is why I wanted to present it to you. Next item. I can't get through it otherwise. I want to go to this collapse of the British Empire. Not because of the interest it has in itself. And let me take a step back and tell you why you ought to be interested, everyone in this room. What is happening to England is what will happen here. It is our future. We are watching it unfold. Please, long after I'm gone, remember what I just said. It'll help you individually and as a citizen navigate through the disintegration of what you're observing. We are the colony of Great Britain. We are part of that history of that empire. True, we've reversed the roles. From them being the big shot and we being the puny, we have turned it around. But that doesn't mean we're gone from that history. It is our history. A desperate history. So let's review what happened there to put it in a context. First, most important, the crash of 2008 and 9, devastating in England. In its own way, as powerful in England, maybe more so than it was here. So many of you lived, maybe all of you lived through the crash of the last decade since 2008. So you know all the effects here. Well, think of England, it's worse. For example, if you adjust wages for prices, what we call the real wage, how much people got paid, but adjusted for the prices. So if you got 10% more wage, but all the prices went up 10%, you're not any one step further ahead. That's all the word real means, adjusted for price. Adjusted for prices, American average wages are flat. We've gone absolutely nowhere in the last 10 years. We've, as a working class, we've produced more and more wealth, but we didn't get it. It went somewhere else, and you kind of know where it went. Okay. England, not the same story. In England, the real wage dropped by over 10% over the last 10 years. Try to imagine what that means. A working class subjected to the crisis of 2008, sudden vast unemployment, losing their homes because they couldn't make their mortgage payments. But also, when they went back to work, having to take lower and lower wages, all of them. It's a devastating attack on the British standard of living. And it drove the British people not crazy, but made them very angry, very bitter, very casting about. And again, listen to me, because it's not so different from what happens here. Again, it's our history coming a few minutes or a few hours or a few weeks or a few months before it hits here. But the British working class, desperate. Desperate. They didn't know what to do. The left wing in Britain, which is represented by something like the Democratic Party here, only there it's called the Labour Party. Our Republican Party here is roughly their Conservative Party. If Conservative and Labour are their two parties. There is an important difference that the people in charge when the crisis hit were people who were gung-ho for modern capitalism. The Labour Party was once a socialist party. Explicitly and by self-definition, they were a socialist party. But in the modern period, since the 1990s, they stopped with their socialism. And their leader became a person very similar to, say, Bill Clinton. I don't want to say good words or bad words. Well, let's put it this way, I don't have any good ones. I don't want to say bad ones, but sort of that. And the British working class had no use for that, felt betrayed by all of that, and so the British working class didn't know where to go. They were so angry at the left for betraying them, for not protecting them, not even keeping their wages flat the way it was done here, but losing them and losing their public services. The most important public, well, not the most important, but one of the most important public services in England is their National Health Service, the NHS. Their single-payer, basically, healthcare system, the kind of thing we hope maybe one day we'll have. They've already had it for decades. But it's being destroyed by the conservatives who pull away funding, the classic way to kill this kind of thing. So they were losing their health care, their wages were going, it was a disaster. And so they walked away from their traditional support of the Labour Party, much like workers in this country walked away from their traditional support of the Democratic Party. But they didn't know where to go, because voting for the Conservatives, which some of them did, was hard. Britain has unlike America, Britain has a much more developed what we used to call class consciousness. Working class people know that they're that. Their mother and father were that, and they expect to be that. They don't have this idea, well, I'm going to work real hard, go to school, and I'm going to get a wonderful, better job that's going to boost me right out of the working class. Isn't that wonderful? They don't think like that. I mean, some do, but in general, they don't. They expect the Labour Party to be for the working man and woman, and it just wasn't. So they turned, some of them, to vote for the Conservatives, and even more of them stopped participating in politics. Again, familiar this should strike you. Then, 2 or 3 years ago, an interesting thing happened. The old leadership of the Labour Party stood down, and a new leadership had to be elected. And one of the old left-wingers, who was always on the edges, the old militant kind of trade unionist type of guy, socialist, well-known, whose name you now know, Jeremy Corbyn, stood for election as the head of this party. Imagine if Bernie Sanders, not running for president, had stood for the head of the Democratic Party. It doesn't work the same way here, but just roughly. But now imagine that he won, because Jeremy Corbyn brought about 300,000 young British working class people, and some students and so forth, into the party, joined the party in order to vote for him as leader. And he then took over, to the surprise of everybody, and has changed the Labour Party, and is trying now to reposition it to be the champion of the working class. But the bitterness of the working class is deep. They were betrayed for a long time, and Mr. Corbyn hasn't yet been able to make that work. He may not. It's hard to tell. So what do the mass of the British people do? They have nowhere to turn. They're furious at what's being done to them, but they have no organized way to go. And then a weird thing happened. A fight in the Conservative Party led Mr. Cameron, David Cameron, the Prime Minister 2 ago, not Boris Johnson, not Theresa May, but the one before that, David Cameron, to make a fatal mistake. They began a politics inside Britain, which should strike you as familiar, to say to the British working class, we are going to identify what's causing the trouble. You know what's causing your trouble? Don't worry, it's not capitalism. It's not the crash of capitalism. No. Here's what it is. Ready? Immigrants. It's immigrants. Now in England, because it's not America, you can't quite call it non-white immigrants because there's a lot of immigrants in Britain who are white, who come from Eastern Europe looking for work, Polish workers, for example, a big group. So it didn't have the racial, it had some of that, but not like here where it's so clear. In England, it was the immigrants. The immigrants are coming in. They're taking advantage of us. They're using our good social services. They're making us poor. And you know something? It isn't just the immigrants. It is, get ready now, because again, like America, it's the foreigners. When you have a leader stand up and the foreigners are coming, hold on to your wallet. Because 2 minutes later, somebody's hand is going to be somewhere in your business. The foreigner. In England, who was the foreigner? Europeans. Britain was about to become, was already partly part of the European community. And if you're going to be part of the European community, there are rules you have to observe that have been worked out over decades of negotiations. One of them, you all know that, those of you who travel to Europe, no border control. You can move, say, from France to Italy, and where once you had to go through a border checkpoint and show them your passport, you don't have to do any of that now. And goods can travel back and forth, and working people can move to wherever the jobs are. Free movement of people. Aha, the British ruling class, the conservatives said, we know what the problem is. It's those damn immigrants. And it's those Europeans that are pushing their immigrants on us, not to speak of the Caribbean immigrants and the African immigrants and all of them. So what we need to do is to squash the immigrants. Cameron got very frightened with all of this. He got frightened for the same reason that British industry got frightened, because they need the immigrants. The immigrants are important workers, they work very hard, and they work very cheap. Clue, just like here. Just like here. So the Conservative Party split. You even had some people leave the Conservative Party to become an extreme right-wing party. If you see the name Neil Farage, that's one of their leaders and so on. So Mr. Cameron had a great idea. We're going to put it to a vote. He was sure he would win. Do we stay with Europe or do we leave? He was sure they'd win. Of course they stay with Europe. Why? Because Britain without Europe is a small, wet, offshore island of Europe. It has the enormous stature of Staten Island. It's a slight exaggeration, but not much. Not much. Britain without Europe really is kind of unthinkable, especially now. So everybody was sure this would work out. The British working class would vote to stay with Europe because it's crazy to go out. But they were wrong, because that vote gave the working class in England an opportunity to take their middle finger and show the government, this is what we think about all of you. You have really shafted us, first with this capitalist system, then with the crash of 2008, then you bailed out the big banks, then you imposed an austerity on us, and our wages are going down, and our healthcare system is collapsing, and now you want us to vote for it? We're going to vote the opposite of what you want. And they voted to leave. Brexit. We're gone. Is that because they didn't want to be in Europe? It had absolutely nothing to do with it. An average British person today, I don't mean this disrespectfully, has no idea what this is going to mean because nobody really knows what it's going to mean because it's unreal. When you go, if you read the newspapers tomorrow, you will read about a secret document that was exposed today by a mistake that was made by the Conservative Party. History is full of these mistakes. A secret document prepared by the Conservative Party was exposed this today. And that contains a worst-case scenario for what could happen with Brexit if it happens as it's supposed to on Halloween. Another interesting idea. That's it. 31st of October is the day. By the way, Halloween is a British holiday. It's All Hallows Evening. It's where that comes from. Americans have trouble with foreign words, even if they're English. Anyway, it's Halloween. And this document indicates that the worst case scenario, let me be clear, the worst case scenario of what the British Conservative Party is proposing includes, ready, food riots in the streets, martial law. That's why I say it's the end. It's the end of this society. When they were exposed, the leader of the government said, well, that's the worst case scenario. That's not our base case. In other words, you are pursuing a policy whose worst case scenario is that? That's not a reason to avoid the policy if that's a possible outcome? What? They got caught. And so now the country is ripped apart. Capitalist interests who think they might get an advantage by being cut off from Europe want it to happen. Capitalist interests that are terrified of what will happen to them if you get cut off from Europe don't want it to happen. The working class is waking up with documents like the one exposed today, realizing that either way, they're screwed. They're screwed if they stay, because that's what they've been happening, being screwed for a long time. If they stay with what was screwing them, chances are it'll continue screwing you. But if they leave, they're for sure screwed. Because there's nothing changing inside British society. The same people will be running it then as running it now. And the British people all know that. They have nowhere to turn. Last point. This last week, for the first time, a sizable and significant group of British capitalists released a document in which they said the following. Brexit, it's called a no-deal Brexit. They don't make an arrangement, they just leave on the 31st of October. That is so dangerous for British society that we have changed our mind. That is the worst thing that can happen. Better for us would be a government led by Jeremy Corbyn. Folks, think. Bernie Sanders is recycling Franklin Roosevelt. The same conditions that made it possible for a Roosevelt to be president for 4 terms is evolving now, and they may also come to the opinion that this guy, weird with that socialism in his name, is less dangerous for us than who? The British capitalists did not hesitate to point the finger. They pointed at Boris Johnson, known in England as the British Trump, and said, he's worse than Corbyn. We're going with Corbyn. And if you follow this in English politics, you'll see that Mr. Corbyn is now being treated more and more by the media as a great statesman. 3 weeks ago, he was a raving leftist lunatic. But whew, how quickly When a society begins to disintegrate, these kinds of shifts are not at all unusual. But Britain is in the final stages of a reckoning with its own history. It began as a cold, wet, offshore island of Europe, and it is returning to that position, painful as it is, above all for the British, who keep imagining that what has happened to them either hasn't happened or will one day be turned around when another Shakespeare arises. Amazing, amazing what is going on. Okay, let me turn then for the rest of this evening to the major item, which is the economic warfare, because that's what it is, between the United States and the People's Republic of China. It is in many ways the defining struggle of our time, likely to remain so for quite a while. Not 100% clear, I mean, at least not to me, how this is going to end up. So if you thought I was going to tell you where this is going to go, I wish I could, but I can't. But I can give you some insights, I hope, into what is going on and why. Okay, I'm going to do it two different ways. The first way, I'm going to talk about the three different levels at which this war is being fought, and then we'll talk about, the winners, the losers, and all of the rest. First, the long run, the long perspective, the historical perspective. China is a rising power, an ascending economic and political powerhouse. Just a few facts for you, because these facts are crucial and should be the framework within which everything else that I say follows. Okay. The United States has roughly 325 million people. Right? China has 4 times that number of people. So we're not talking about societies that are equal. One has 4 people for every 1 person in the other one. Please, you have to keep that in your mind. Number 2, for the last 30 years, under the control, the unique control of the Chinese Communist Party, they have organized and operated a particular kind of economy. Here are the qualities to keep in mind of that economy. Number 1, whereas 40 years ago, the bulk of industry was owned and operated by the government, which in turn was dominated by the Communist Party, over the last 40 years, a very large portion of the Chinese industrial economy was turned over to private ownership and operation. At the same time, the government's control, which remains very important and very large, was decentralized, so that some government enterprises are owned and operated by the national government, but a lot of them are owned and operated by regional or state governments and also by local, city, and county governments. So when you think of the central government, no, it's a decentralized government. And the job of the central government is mostly the coordination of all of this. The relations among the government enterprises with one another, the relationship of the government enterprises to the private enterprises, the relationships among the private enterprises. The Communist Party, through the government, regulates and controls all of that. They also opened up, once the United States ended, I assume you're all aware, when the Russian Revolution happened in 1917, the United States refused to recognize them. Functioned as if there was nobody there. It was only many years later, under Roosevelt, that the government of the United States recognized the Soviet Union. Same thing happened with the Chinese Revolution in 1949. The government did not recognize them for many years, if you remember, until Nixon and Kissinger opened China up, as if they were closed before. But all that meant was they recognized them. With that recognition, the Chinese began to allow American companies, as they had done with Japanese and Europeans before, to come in. Most of the time, it's very important, most of the time they required the foreign company to be in partnership of some sort with a Chinese company, either a private one or a state one, or even a combination of all three. And a deal was struck, a deal which could not be forced on anybody by the Chinese government, and was not. Here was the deal. I'll use the example of the United States, but the same deal was made with British companies or German companies or Japanese companies. We know why you want to come to China, they said. You want to use our workers who are way cheaper than the workers in your own country. We understand that. We're not stupid. And you want access to our market because we're the biggest country on earth, and even though our people are average low income, we got so many of them that you can sell things. There's always been a fantasy in the West. 100 years ago, it was the fantasy, just imagine if you were a toothbrush maker, if you could be the toothbrush maker for China. All those teeth. Could you sell toothbrushes? Oh my goodness.
The lamps of China.
Yeah, it was, or the lamp, or the toilet paper, or your imagination can take it. So here's the deal that was struck. We know you want to hire our workers who are cheap, who are well disciplined and increasingly well educated. So they're good workers, they're hard workers, they're disciplined workers, and they're cheap. Very attractive. We know you want that. And that's fine. We'll deliver them to you. We also know you want access to the Chinese market. You want to sell into China. We have a growing market. Starting in the 1990s, they had the fastest growing market in the world, which they still do. Don't ever forget it. For the last 25 years, if you're a capitalist anywhere in the world, and if what you're concerned about is the growth of the market for whatever you produce, you've got to be in China because that's the fastest growing demand for everything. And so the Chinese said, we know you want cheap labor and we know you want access to our market. We will give you that. And here's what we want. You've got to give us your technology. You've got to show us the machinery. You have to share your techniques with us so that we can learn them. And there was no hiding it. We want to develop our own industry with these techniques. We want a Chinese industry to develop. We will work together with you. But that's a deal. You don't want the deal, fine. Have a nice day. But if you want the cheap labor of China, and if you want access to the Chinese market, you've got to share your technology, okay? When you hear now both the left and the right, Democrats and Republicans, telling you about intellectual property theft, that's what they mean. Here's what they want. They want Americans to have cheap labor, access to China, and give in return nada, which the Chinese say, not gonna happen. Not gonna happen. And so when Mr. Trump said, well, we have to have an agreement on intellectual property, the Chinese say, in Chinese, well, I won't repeat it. You're not going to get that. Okay, next, context before we get to the punchlines. Context. This partly public, partly private capitalist, by the way, all capitalists, if by capitalist you mean the structure of an enterprise in which there's a relatively small number of people who function as the employer and a relatively large number of people who function as the employees, such that the employer pays a wage to the employee. But all the decisions, what to produce, how to produce, what technology to use, where to produce, and what to do with the profits are made by the relatively small group of people or the employers. If that's what you mean by capitalism, and that's certainly what I mean, then both the public and the private enterprises in China were capitalist by that definition. In one case, it was government officials who were the board of directors. In another case, it was private individuals elected by shareholders. So the people were different, and how you got to be the employer was different. But you were an employer faced with employees. You paid wages, et cetera, et cetera. So you had a complicated public and private capitalist system managed by the state, strong regulation, which in turn was managed by a very well-organized, unique political organization, the Communist Party. That was China's economy. That is China's economy. All that's changed is the balance. The relative importance of the private has grown, and the relative importance of the state enterprises has shrunk. But mostly that's it. Now here's the reality. Over the last 25 years, the average annual growth of output, which we call GDP in economics, gross domestic product is what GDP stands for. The growth of the GDP, a convention used all over the world to measure how big an economy is getting, has averaged over 25 years between 6, which is low, which is what it is now, and 9%, sometimes over. Over the same period of time, the growth of the GDP of the United States has fluctuated between 2 and 3%. So let me do that again. Rate of growth of product in this country, 2 to 3% per year. Rate of growth of product in China, 6 to 9%. Do you understand? That's why they're catching up. Because they're growing faster, year in and year out. To those people around the world, and I hope it includes a lot of you in this room, who understand that for most of the people in the world who live in poor countries that have been poor one hell of a long time, the number one objective, whether you agree with it or not is not the question, but the number one objective is to stop being poor and to become comfortable, maybe even rich. If that's your goal, and that's a big one for a lot of people, then the contest between China and the rest of the world is no contest. It's over. The Chinese won. Everybody else lost. Nobody comes close. And for those of you who live in the world where these kinds of informations are somehow not available to you, in the 20th century, there was also one country that grew faster than everybody else. It was called the Soviet Union. If the 20th century fastest grower was the Soviet Union and the 21st century's fastest grower was the People's Republic of China, you ought to draw some implication from this. Something has to occur.
Why did they collapse in 92?
Good. I wish, maybe we'll devote a whole session to why they did. I wrote a book, which any of you are interested in, trying to explain. No, we did, because we felt as Marxists that we had a job to explain why that fell apart, what happened there. Because if Marxists don't explain it, then only the people who don't like Marxism will offer their explanations, and those will be different. Yeah, but it certainly did collapse, and that's an obligation for people like us to explain.
So what was your book?
It's called Class Theory and History. It's published in 2002 by Routledge. It's a big British publisher. And it has a subtitle, Capitalism and Communism in the USSR. It's an attempt to explain why it developed and why it collapsed. Anyway, let's stay with what we are. Second factoid. Over the last 30 years, the average real wage of an American worker has gone nowhere, stagnant, flat, like I mentioned to you earlier. That actually goes back to the late 1970s. The real wage of an average real wage in the United States today is roughly what it was at the end of the 1970s. Over the same period of time, the average real wage of the Chinese worker quadrupled. Do you understand? Did the Chinese start from a lower level? Absolutely, much poorer. But most people measure how they're doing in relationship to their own situation. When the Chinese working class asks, how are we doing under communism? The answer is, whoopee. It's very hard for Americans. Let me do that again. Whoopee. Just the same reaction you would get from most Americans if over the last 20 years they could say, my standard of living has quadrupled. You know what that would mean? It would mean I wouldn't have to go into debt to send my kids to college, would I? I wouldn't be worrying about debts half the time because I would have been able to afford these things without borrowing money because my income would have allowed me to do it. Okay, so you have to have this in your mind, otherwise the rest of it you won't get. So this is a big, fat problem. The Chinese are rising. They're already the biggest country on earth, and they have managed, despite their enormous population, scrunched on relatively, they're not the biggest by geography, they're the biggest by population. Russia, for example, is much bigger geographically than China is, but has a much smaller population. So there are an awful lot of people scrunched in a small place that lacks a lot of key resources. For example, oil and gas. One of the biggest things for China for the last 20 years, and will continue. They've got to get oil and gas from somebody else. They can't proceed without it. They're working night and day to try to figure that out. Nuclear energy, solar energy. That's why they're ahead in these areas. Their survival depends on it. If you have a solar panel on your roof, it comes from China, and the technology for sure. They have to. Okay, so the Chinese are growing very quickly. They've mastered how to grow quickly. They're the best at it. And it's not a flash in the pan because it's been going on for 30 years. Even in the face of this trade war, this year, which is a poor year for them relative to their history, is 6%. What is it this year in this country? 2.5%. What? Not even close. It doesn't take very long for poor and rich countries to pass one another when one of them is going like this and the other one is going like that. That's what you have. So the United States is facing a reality which the people in charge understand. We have a major competitor, the likes of which we have not had for a long time. And the Chinese are very, very good at many things. They have their own Google, their own Facebook. They do all of that. One of the reasons that Trump went after this company, some of you notice, Huawei, is because Huawei, utilizing what's called 5G technology, the next generation, G is just generation, 5th generation of this technology. Huawei is better at this than any American company. And there's a problem there. And they're not the only one, nor is that the only industry. The Chinese, over the last 20 years, have poured vast new resources into their university system, subsidizing huge numbers of students, particularly in areas like the STEM fields, engineering, and so forth. The United States, by comparison, is doing what? If you look at the funding of public universities in America educate 3/4 of our graduates from college. So higher education in the United States is mostly a public event. You hear about the private ones because they're the ones with the money. Harvard, Yale, Princeton, and all of that. But it's the public school. And with one exception, the state of North Dakota is the one exception. All the other 49 states have been cutting the funds for public higher education. These are signs, folks. We are cutting, the Chinese are flooding. And the results are already showing up, and they will only become more extreme. So one aspect of the struggle between the United States and China is a classic example of the increasingly desperate anxiety of the declining power in the face of the rising one. It is the flip side of what the situation was, say, a century ago, when the ancient Chinese empire was confronted by the arriving European and American armies and navies. If you ever want to read about it, one of the saddest kind of story, it's called the Boxer Rebellion. At the end of the 19th century, as the Europeans just took pieces of China away and had a war against the old imperial Chinese society, and the imperial Chinese society was in no way able to compete and took desperate efforts, including ceding large parts of their territory, particularly around the cities like Shanghai and so on, to the Europeans, who simply took chunks of the city, walled them around, and had them as European enclaves. That's where places like Hong Kong began. Britain arranged for the Chinese to give them a 99-year lease. Good timing. And that's why Hong Kong is what it is and was what it was. It only went back to China at the end of the 99 years a few years ago. And those people are used to a different arrangement, and now, as you can see, are not happy with what they have to accommodate to with the Chinese. Okay? So there's a clash here that has to be understood at that level. Here's a second one. That the United States, this is a different level of this issue. The United States has got a very complicated economic entwinement with China, right? This is different from clashing two societies. They depend on each other. This is like, imagine a horrific marriage of two people. Obviously, it's something hard for you to imagine. None of you have that or see it or have any feeling for that. So just imagine with me a couple that didn't get along real well, but had become what psychologists call codependent. You know, they need each other, which they can't quite face, and they hate each other and they love each other, and what a mess. Okay, that's a good way for me to ask you to think about the United States and China. Let me give you just 2 or 3 examples of the intertwinement. Over the last 40 years, the American working class could be paid way less than they otherwise would have demanded to be paid. Why? Because they could buy cheap Chinese products. You all learned when you went to TJ Maxx or Sears or Walmart or Target, or Marshalls, you know, all the places where we go to shop for clothing and appliances. We were able to buy, if we had an interesting experiment, and I asked you all, please stand up, take off all your clothes, and then come one by one to the front of the room. Some of you are getting horrified already, but it's just imaginary exercise. Otherwise, I'll get in trouble with the authorities here. I'm not proposing that you do it, just an imaginary. And then I asked you to come up and put over here the pile of all the clothes made in the United States, and over here the pile of all the clothes that say made in China, on your blouse or your pants or your gloves or whatever. You all know what the result is. The pile from China would be high, and the pile from the United States low. And half of those that say United States, it's lying anyway. Retailers have long understood, particularly in certain parts of the country, that if you change the label from made in China to made in the United States, you sell twice as many. Right? Okay, so here's the thing. If we actually carry this policy through, Mr. Trump's, and we hit them with a tariff that drives up the price of your underpants, you know what the working class in this country is going to do? It's going to have to demand higher wages because it's going to have the money to buy something other than from China, which is a lot more expensive, and that's taken 30 years to develop all of that. American capitalists don't want an angry working class demanding higher pay so they can buy underpants. The American capitalist wants them to be equipped with cheap underpants. You understand? So today, right now, as we're talking, there is a highest level delegation that can be made of the United States Chamber of Commerce. It's in Beijing begging the Chinese government to cut a deal, to stop this crazy business. They are, the Chamber of Commerce, the enemy of Mr. Trump. And everybody Many Americans don't know this, but I didn't make it up. Go Google the Chamber of Commerce. You'll read about the delegate, because it's not a secret, but it is something that we don't look at. Well, I want you to think about it. Here's the second interaction, just as important. Because the American working class has become the consumer of Chinese goods, the flow of dollars, US currency, to China to pay for the underpants and the toaster and the car is much larger, ready, than the flow of Chinese money here. We buy from them way more than they buy from us. Well, you know what that does? That builds up a load of dollars in China that have nothing, they don't come back because the Chinese don't need them or want them because they're not buying that much from us. What do the Chinese do with all the dollars coming in? If you're a Chinese producer of underpants, you get the dollars, millions of dollars, but they're dollars. You can't go into a downtown restaurant in Beijing and have a meal with dollars. So they go to the government bank, this is how finance works, and they translate, they cash in the dollars for Chinese currency, which is what they do business in. Which means the government, which runs these banks, is now accumulating an enormous hoard, ready, of dollars. But that's useless. So what does the Chinese government do for 40 years? It turns around and takes the dollars, for which it has no use, and lends it to the United States government. They buy treasury securities, that's what it's called. The government issues bonds when it borrows. In other words, are you ready? The Chinese government is the largest single creditor of the United States of America. Its money lent to the Treasury helps pay for the losing war in Afghanistan, which the Chinese oppose as they finance it. This is called high finance. You can imagine what low finance is. It also means that the Chinese are in a very powerful position to make life in America very difficult. Why? Because they own all these treasuries. Suppose they decided tomorrow to play real hardball with Mr. Trump. They would start selling them. They would stop buying them. And where is the United States going to find another China to pick it up? There isn't one, which means the United States government would have all kinds of new problems borrowing money. Current deficit of the United States this year, $1 trillion, without which the United States can't function. Oh my goodness. Oh Jesus. We depend on each other. The United States depends on them not cashing in those treasuries. The United States depends on China to keep sending cheap consumer goods. The Chinese, for their part, depend on all kinds of specific things from the United States. They buy components for a lot of their electronic equipment from American companies, for which they have no substitute, would be a real problem. For those of you who know about these things, China is not as far advanced with anti-cancer pharmaceuticals. As a Chinese population gets older, which it is doing quickly, it is having cancer more and more. It needs cancer drugs. If you notice, the Chinese government announced yesterday and this morning that they are taking back some of the tariffs that they had imposed in that tit for tat between them and Trump. Why? Because at the end of this month, they're resuming negotiations. The leading Chinese is, I believe, coming here to Washington to negotiate with Trump. And as a sign of good faith, the Chinese are always doing this. As a sign of good faith, they canceled some of the tariffs. And one of the things they canceled the tariffs on were cancer pharmaceuticals, because they need those. So you have mutual need, but I want to stress to you that the need of the United States for them is, if anything, greater than the other way around. So now we have a clash of two civilizations, but a difficult one because we need each other so badly. And now the last level. The last level is about Mr. Trump's re-election. And for those of you who don't pay attention, let me urge you, virtually everything that is going on now, and surely everything that will go on for the next year, is about that. First and foremost, Mr. Trump wants to be re-elected, and he is terrified that he won't be. And Lord knows what he may do if he isn't. He has already several times hinted that he won't go quietly, that he will unleash his followers. He particularly mentions the military and the police, where he has so much support. I mean, the man has verbal diarrhea, but nonetheless, some of it, there's something there. Whatever it is, there's something there. So he's worried. And where does the China war fit in? Two things. Number one, here he is being Mr. America First. Listen to the story. We Americans have been victimized. The Mexicans took advantage of us. The Canadians took advantage of us. The Europeans took advantage of us. The Chinese, even the Indians took advantage of us. To hear him talk, you've got the person who is the perfect victim. Everybody is taking advantage. Who is that talking to? Put aside Mr. Trump, a basket case, that's something else. But who is he tapping into? The American people, who feel victimized every which way, in large part because they are. So now he makes a bond. I'm you and you're me, we're victimized, and I'm gonna stand up and stop it. That's what they want. They want their victimization, their lousy wages, their crappy jobs, they're loaded up with debt, all the things that are squeezing them from every side. He is gonna turn that around, and he makes a strong case. I don't wanna go in this direction, but try to compare that bonding with Hillary Clinton. No contest, none. So he's milking that because it's worked for him. He went from a real estate hustler who lost most of the money his father left him to become the president playing that game. And China is the perfect other. I am going to teach them a lesson. Look at me, America first. They're not going to victimize us. So partly, this is his theater of re-election. That's how he's going to do it. He has to play that. There's only so far you can go calling Mexicans names. It didn't go as well as he had hoped. Even the bashing of the immigrants pretty much played itself out. But this China, which is a big, powerful thing that nobody knows much about, and is conveniently also not white, or at least in the American mentality, not white, is a good target. He is the powerful. But here now comes the contradiction. By slapping them around, his hope was, let me quote to you early on, tariff wars are not a problem. They are easy to win, that's a quote, and it's easy to win quickly. That was early in 2018. Here we are, most of the way through 2019. He hasn't won, and it sure as hell isn't quickly. So he's got a problem. But he can salvage the problem if he has, ready, a dramatic breakthrough. Let's hope maybe late winter, early spring coming, just in time to milk it for all the political juice you can squeeze, sorry for the mixed metaphor, out of this. That would be a great, and portray whatever deal he cuts as a tremendous victory. I mean, knowing him, whatever he does is a tremendous victory. So he will make a tremendous victory that America, all of that. But there's still more contradiction. Why? Because the Chinese are never, ever going to permit, and they don't need to, the United States to dictate to them what kind of economy they have, what pace of growth they're going to have. They're not going to do that. Just like he can jump up and down, say whatever he wants about Hong Kong. The decision about what happens in Hong Kong is going to be made in Beijing and nowhere else. And the rest of the world may not like it. You may not like it. I may not like it. But that's how it is. And there's nothing that's going to change that. The Chinese know it, and they have that strength, the quiet strength of the guy who's got the biggest stick in the room. But here's the contradiction. The longer it drags out, the longer Mr. Trump can't get from the Chinese even the little bit needed to portray himself as a victor, the more damage it does to the economy. And he needs to run as the president in a great economy, but he is undercutting the great economy. So now he's got to, oh my God, what am I going to do now? A recession, if it comes between now and, say, August of next year, if it comes in the next year, that's his election's over. He's done. He's fine. He's finished. He knows that. What is he going to do? He can't stop the fight with China. He'll look like a loser. But the very fight with China is bringing that recession closer because it's messing up the world economy. So he's got two ways to handle it. Number one, he's got to begin now to blame somebody else for the recession. Who is that? The Federal Reserve. Every day he attacks the Federal Reserve. 2 days ago, they are boneheads. This is an extraordinary label for the head of the financial authority in your society. Boneheads, really. He wants to, remember, I already told you, he wants to lower the interest rate, negative interest. He doesn't care. Because what he wants from them is irrelevant. He wants them not to do what he wants them to do so that he can blame them when the recession hits, if it does. He's stuck. He's desperate. If he was willing to bring the Taliban to Camp David in the secrecy of the nighttime, imagine what he would do with the premier in China or with the negotiators in China. You're at a point, again, the metaphor with England, you're at a point of it's all unraveling. The biggest thing Mr. Trump has in this whole crazy China mess, which is one of the reasons he went after China, is he gets no effective opposition from the Democratic Party at all. It's a free shot. The Democrats are still so lost in their history of anti-communism and anti-socialism and anti-China that they have nothing to say. They can't make an analysis. They can't expose anything. They basically want to beat up on China too. Remember Mrs. Clinton? She was interested in making wars here, there, and the next place. What is this? Here's the important, these are fundamental dead ends. In the remaining 2 minutes, gainers and losers. China and the United States are both losing from this war. The silly estimates, which one is losing more? I do a lot of radio and television interviews these days, and I'm constantly asked, which one is losing more? The answer is, nobody knows that. That'll take years of research to try to begin to get an answer to that question, and there'll be lots of disputes about whatever answers are coming up, because it's very difficult to do. So the answer is nobody knows. What we do know is it's bad for the Chinese economy, it's bad for the United States economy, and it continues to be bad. So winners and losers, nah, there's just losers here. This is Mr. Trump's political gambit for re-election, overlaid by people with grandiose notions, like poor Mr. Bolton, who really wants to change, regime change in China, which is crazy stuff, and he's gone, but they probably get another one like it. Trade wars and military wars. The history of capitalism is the history of trade disputes and tariff disputes degenerating into military disputes. If you look at the history before World War I and you look at the history before World War II, there were major clashes among the leading capitalist countries. In those eras, Germany and England were the kind of major ones, but you bring in the other ones, the tendency to go from one to the other when you can't work out your economic problems to resort to a military solution are always in the wings. That's why when you read, some of you do, you'll see that the American Navy has sent ships into the South China Sea. And these are little probings to see what can be done. Very, very dangerous. US isolationism. Yes, there are ideologues here. Mr. Bolton was one of them. They really think that the United States can and should smash the Chinese. And there's two ways to do that. One, military confrontation. Probably the American military has explained to them this is suicide, so don't go there. There are signs of the American military's very standoffish relationship to Trump. You get a lot of that in the European newspapers. Of course, you don't get that here. That's one way. But there's another way, and that's isolationism. Just withdraw. Shut off access of the rest of the world to the United States. Turn inward, close your borders with walls, but literally turn in. Isolationism has been an American idea in the past. In the early part of the 20th century, it was very strong. There is this notion we can make it ourselves. The rest of the world wouldn't be a threat to us if we hadn't leaked our secrets, our technology. It's that kind of American superiority mentality. And if we shut down, if we don't give them, if we tell Huawei and every other company like that, you can't have our technology, well, then they'll all disintegrate. It's a little bit like when I go to seminars about the Chinese economic development and I try to point out what it's been doing. My colleagues who love capitalism explained to me, oh yes, the Chinese have been growing very nicely, but that's because they allowed private capitalism. In other words, they live in a syllogistic world. If there's good news, it's capitalism. If there's bad news, it's something else. And the whole world is organizing, but you stop talking to that person because it's having a conversation with cement. Gets boring after a while, And now finally the election, the key part about the election. Mr. Trump has to resolve this crazy crap, or else he's done. If a recession comes, and that's the biggest problem he has right now, his biggest risk that's in his mind, he looks at the Democratic candidates and he can't decide which one of them will be better for him to run against. You all have to understand, he sees them all as arriving with big burdens. And this may come as a surprise to you. The two he's probably most worried about are Sanders and Warren. And so you may begin to see, there are already some signs that this is going to shape up to be his biggest worry. But he's not really worried much about them. He's worried about, above all, a recession. Remember, the recession is what brought in his great nemesis, Obama. The collapse of the economy in 2007 and 8, at the end of George Bush's term, created the groundswell, in his mind, and for many people, the groundswell that swept Obama into office. He knows that. Everything he does is anti-Obama, as you all know. So for him, the nightmare is to have happened to him what happened to George Bush, so that the next Obama can arrive or something like that. So the recession is the problem, and here's the final thing for tonight. Is a recession coming? Now, the answer to that question in capitalism is always the same. Yes. No, I mean that. Capitalism is 300 or 400 years old. It started in Britain, it spread to Europe, from there to North America, Japan, and eventually the whole world. Wherever capitalism settled, wherever, and became the dominant system, you had an economic downturn every 4 to 7 years. It's the average. Every economic historian knows it. It's been a terrible problem for capitalism from the beginning. Other systems had downturns, but they had one of two explanations. Nature, it rained too much, it rained too little, the soil got exhausted. So other economic systems have had downturns if nature turned against them. And the other big cause, war. If you have war, it really messes up your economy. And capitalism has suffered from natural problems and war. But capitalism has a new additional thing. Every 4 to 7 years, with or without nature, with or without war, we have a downturn. A downturn, a recession, a depression, a cycle, a crisis, a business cycle. You get the picture? Lots of words, because it's always with us. Every 4 to 7 years, boom, millions of people thrown out of work, jobs disappear, businesses go out, bizarre. There's a joke I tell when I teach my classes. I look to my students across the podium and I say to them, if you live with a roommate as unstable as capitalism, you would have moved out years ago. Right? It's an unstable system. It has plagued capitalism. They have tried everything to stop it. They know why. Every 4 to 7 years, you throw people out of work. If that were a random process, that any one of us could be the one on this time. And remember, if between the time you're 20 and the time you're 70, you're going to go through a lot of these every 4 to 7 years. Sooner or later, it's going to get you. And you know what happens then? You lose your money, you lose your savings, you lose your house, your family falls apart. Okay? So if this were a random risk for all the working class, capitalism would be gone. It's unbearable. Not just the happening of it, but the anxiety of fear about it. How do you commit to buying a house, paying over 20 years when you could at any time lose it because this crazy instability? So the capitalists have understood that. They've tried to figure it out. In the 1930s, when capitalism really took a dive, the Great Depression, we even had an entirely new economics developed by a very smart British fellow, John Maynard Keynes, designed to figure out why does this happen and what do we do to at least have them less often or not so bad. Nothing works. That's why we just had another one in 2008, proving that all the lessons we learned in the past don't add up to an ability to stop it. So Mr. Trump is advised by people who know, of course there's a recession. Your only hope is this: postpone it. Push it back a few months, 6 months, 9 months, so that you can have the election before it hits, so that Mr. Trump will survive, and on the morning after the election, an advisor will give him that famous remark made by Louis XVI, the 16th king of France. Famous remark: "Après moi, le déluge." After me, it blows up. That's the issue for him. And he is going to play out this game with China, no matter what the cost to the Chinese, or for that matter, to the United States. How far will he go? There is no limit. I'll end with telling you what he has already done. When he started hitting the Chinese with tariffs, they're very smart, and they came back with a tariff, a particular one, on soybeans. The Chinese, as if you know the Chinese diet, they use a lot of soybean oil, they use a lot of soybeans, but a major part of their diet, and they need to import it. They don't make enough of it, they don't grow enough. And the United States had become dependent on China for selling most of the soybeans. And there are several states in the Midwest that depend on soybeans and that voted for Mr. Trump, and who might not if they can't sell their soybeans. The Chinese hit the soybeans with a tariff so that the cost of American soybeans went up because the importer in China would have to pay the American price plus the tariff that the Chinese government put on. So the Chinese people couldn't afford American soybeans, so they went to Brazil, which is a major producer of soybeans. But the Brazilians are ecstatic. They're excited that they could become, and they are becoming, the #1 supplier for China, the most populous country in the world. And one of the consequences is burning down the Amazon to grow the soybean. You understand the interconnections of the world? Good. How did Mr. Trump now, what did he do? He's in trouble. The farmers in the Midwest that grow soybeans are getting pissed off at him. That's an economic term. Pissed off. Okay? Pissed off, but he had a solution. He came up with, ready? $20 billion. He gave them as a gift. He bought their votes. But the best part is, you all, with your taxes, provided him with that money. So he used the taxes we pay to buy the votes his China policy risked losing for him. A man like that, there are no limits to what he will do as he proceeds. And that, in the end, will be the determinant, more than anything else, of what happens in this war with China. As you can see, the Chinese are constantly giving him, making us concessions, hoping to find some way to give him enough to stop this craziness. Whether that works or not, I don't know. Any more than I can tell you whether Boris Johnson, the crazy fellow at the head of the, or maybe, we don't even know, the calls for him to resign. I don't know if you're aware, but there are demonstrations across Britain demanding his, just a footnote. It only took 3 weeks for the British people to get rid of their crazy Trump. Here we are 3 years later, we still can't do it. Tells you something. Folks, we've come to the end.